Hello and welcome to my secret laboratory in the Sligo Hills. This is Kevin Barry on behalf of the Mighty Hot Press magazine. I'm pontificating in the current issue in the company of Mr. Pat Carty um, about, amongst many other things, this new collection of stories called That Old Country Music, and I'm going to recite one of these stories now, and it's titled Old Stock. The spring had been long and cold. The wind that came across the lake still had winter's bite, and the house was wearing its age and ached loudly in the wind as though poorly, and I was myself sick in the bowel, the gut, and the gums. Or the nerves, in other words, or the soul. I badly needed to get out of County Sligo, and it was word of an imminent death that allowed me to. Early in May, the call came through that Uncle Aldo was on his way out up in Donegal. It was a miracle he was even going still. Aldo had drank like a fool always and chased women and crashed cars. He burned summonses. He fell out of a hotel one time and landed on a taxi. I was the last of his close relations. He was my father's only brother, and my father was long dead. The lungs, in either case, that had carted them off. The lungs and the dampness, I suppose. Here's a very old joke. Cause of death, the west of Ireland. Aldo had mostly been a figure of my childhood. His visits had been antic, unpredictable. I remember him one Christmas in plaster of Paris to the shoulder, lurching into the house, lame as an old pirate, and nagging of John Power's whiskey in his free paw. Another time in the company of a foul-mouthed blind girl called Margaret. Once so atrociously drunk he pissed in a corner of the guest bedroom and there was murder over it. My mother put him out of the house the next morning. But I had seen him infrequently in recent years, and I was a little surprised that contact had been made at all, and to be summoned to his deathbed like this. I aimed the car north for Donegal, and though my business was sombre, I felt a quiet soaring of the heart. I clearly welcomed this chance of a visit to the country outside Glentees, where my uncle was living out this last spell. And yes, it was very beautiful there. It was early in the Maytime, and there were dreamy glens and rooky woods and all the rest of it, the mountains in their pure realm and so forth. And being closer to the coast, the sky was cleaner and the air that much quicker. The expanse of clean, raw light was reviving. And anyway, Aldo was 80 fucking odd. I mean, how devastated was I supposed to be? His cottage looked across a bog to the Blue Stack Mountains. The ocean was nearby, unseen but palpable. There were huge granite boulders around the fields, as if giants had been tossing them about for sport. The ocean hissed at the edges of the scene like a busy gossip. There was salt on the air, and the local cars wore coats of rust. I felt, somehow, a little hardier and tougher in myself as I looked out from the doorway of Aldo's place. I was in shade from the noon sunlight under the strands of a whitethorn's blossom. I rested its tiny flowers in the palm of my hand and blew on them. Bad luck, they say, to bring it into the house. The doctor smiled. Are you superstitious? More so than I used to be, actually. Once identified as family, I had become, in the usual way, a functionary of the dying. I was consulted by the doctor and by a priest. Aldo had refused the hospital and abused the cleric. The doctor said there was only so much he could do. He murmured the usual words, we'll try make him comfortable at least. Aldo was fixed to an oxygen rig-up. He was pumped full of the good stuff. He was in and out of consciousness. Hours rather than days, the doctor said, and we agreed together in the native way that he'd nearly be as well off out of it. Hence to the deathbed. Aldo was much reduced. He was a remnant of himself already. It was heartbreaking, actually. He was thrown back against a cast iron bedstead, a 19th century original I reckoned at a glance you could sell for two and a half grand in Dublin. In fact, everything in the cottage was antique and beautifully functional and reeked of a kind of authenticity I had a great yearning for. Uncle Aldo told me at once, with the oxygen mask ripped melodramatically from his face, that the place was to be mine. Oh, Jesus, Aldo, I said. That's too much. He was going quickly. A new life yawned open before me. I looked out towards the blue stacks and I could hear the sea, and the mountains were hard founded in the clear evening light. When he could get the words out in these final hours, they came in quick, lucid rushes. He was on his last visits back to himself, and he spoke mostly of old jobs, old adventures. I fucked a nun once in Moose Jaw, he said. Where's Moose Jaw? I said. Canada, he said. There was great money that time laying tarn in Canada. She was after hopping the convent wall of a Tuesday. This was the Thursday. Once he woke and took me to be his brother, but then as myself again. With a weak sweeping of the hand, he displayed the room around him, the house, my legacy. The place isn't worth tuppence, he said. No point selling it. He beckoned me to come closer. There could be a tumour the size of a small dog eating you from the inside out, he said. You wouldn't even know it. Okay, I said. So what you should do, he said, is live your fucking life. I have you now, I said. And I tell you, he said, this place, whatever way this house was set down, just here, on this spot, I can't explain it, but the women go mental fucking gamey as soon as they get a waft of the place at all. With a surge of unnatural strength, he clawed me towards his chest and rasped the words at me. Get them sat in there by a peat fire with a glass in their hand, he said, and they can't keep the clothes on their backs. As he dozed off for a while, dozed, maybe a little pretty for what he was up to, I went outside and circled the cottage slowly. Aldo had a round of sally trees for a windbreak, and they moved in the stiff breeze now to show charms of light. This place could wreak fucking havoc on a man's prose if he let it. Perhaps the austerity of South Sligo had been the saving of me. Looking out at endless rain and reed fields, you were not inclined towards a curlicute or ornamental style. But here the aspect was glamorous and drunk-baking. I went inside again, scared of it, and examined the old crockery, the time-worn flags of the stone floor, the poignant maw of the original peasant fireplace. I went to find Aldo, alert again, but for the last time, in his chamber. Your father was a strange drinker, he said. Lazarus, I used to call him. He'd look to be on his way out after 6 or 7 pints, kind of swaying and half rolling, but then suddenly he'd straighten the shoulders, suck down a bit of wind and go again for another 3 or 4 hours, looking at you like a judge. That was your father, he said. Aldo, the complicated event now of his dying face. That tick, this tiny wrenching, and what did this last cloud that passed across his streaming eyes tell? Aldo, proud as a hawk and poor as a wren, the closing of the eyes, and then at once the final thing. And suddenly he was without life or pain. I went outside. I had a rush of true feeling. This could be the place for me, all right. Maybe the thin film of skin between me and the world would at last here be pierced. I would be at one with the natural things, with mountain, sky, and sea. There is a belief, of course, that the love of nature is a type of spilt religion. And to develop it later on in life, in one's 40s, is suspicious stuff indeed. And there was something unseemly in the way I was almost weeping with happiness as I walked the lyric fields and lanes in the blissful June evenings. But it was in this manner, over those slow weeks, that I mourned my uncle, and more than I would have expected to. I fell quickly into a routine in my new home. I was neat as a sparrow about my days. I was up as it got bright. I no longer took the metaphorical whip to myself as soon as I woke. In fact, I treated myself like a lord. I had soda bread toasted and slathered heavily with butter, a pot of strong tea at its side. I added a splash of cream to my porridge, sometimes a little whiskey. I listened without panic to the morning news. The world receded beautifully from my new hide in the northwest. It was a plain but luxuriant life in the well-swept cottage, the door left open to a fine, thickening summer. A solicitor's office in Donegal was on to me about the will and the deeds, but I sailed through it all. Nothing was a bother to me up here. I seemed to carry myself in a much calmer way. I was slow and deliberate about things. Suddenly I had an old farmer's patient style. I walked the narrow roads and waved stoically to passing strangers in holiday rentals. I was a reassuring presence, I felt, on these roads. On a peg on the back of the kitchen door, I found an old cap of Aldo's, a proper Donegal tweed, and I perched it at a jaunty angle rising from my forehead. I began to get the sense that life is not much more than an inch or two deep, really. How you display the surface of things can dictate all else. I eased into my new skin. I thought about Aldo plenty. The evenings would be a sad time. Here I was among all his old things, and I believed that Aldo's talk of women had been no more than an old man's wishful thinking. He had been alone, lonely, and sick here. The cottage was cold enough, even on these summer evenings, and I burnt a few sticks for warmth, for company. I drank not much, read sparingly. I had no great thirst, and I could not keep my eyes focused on the pages. I was encountering, I believe, some kind of transformation. One night, in January, I had walked out of the Sligo house, crossed the reed fields, walked the greasy planks of the jetty, and attempted to lower myself into the lake. It was the sheer iciness of the black water that forced me back. Then I suppose January is a tough month for everyone, though maybe not to the extent that they try to fucking top themselves. Coming from a small family, I had not much support to summon by phone call, and I had consciously pulled away from my old friends, all of them. But now, in Donegal, in the clear light of summer, I was somehow making amends with myself. I let the music play late and low on Lyric FM. I had the sense I was deflating the last of my old self, slow breath by slow breath. The solicitors were on again. There were more forms to be signed. I said I'd drive down, but this was not necessary. One of their team would be near Glenties on the Friday for the conveyancing of a farm. The forms could be dropped into me. It was a youngish solicitor who came by the cottage. She was attractive, quite dark, with a Donegal accent like running velvet. She stood with me by the doorway where the whitethorn gave shade and dangled its occult strands. "And you'll not put it on the market?" she said. "I might stay a while," I said. She looked towards the kingdom ground of the blue stacks across the way. "There is something about this place," she said. "Have you a long run back?" I said. And yes, I told her it was beautiful country, and the few people I'd met had seemed sweet-natured to me, and I was struck by the great produce available these days in the town markets nearby. "Fantastic local cheeses," I said. I could do you up a sandwich for the road." "And now," she said. "I've a blue cheese from Ardra you'd weep for," I said. "A blue?" she said. "Dairy is my heroin," she said. "I'll make it," I said. "Sure, you can eat it here if you like." I made for the kitchen before she could protest. "I must put a match to that fire," I said. "It gets cool enough still in the evenings." When I served her the sandwich, it was with an air of priestly decorum, and I said, you wouldn't take a drop of wine with that." A laugh rippled mischievously at the back of her slender throat. "I suppose it is a Friday," she said. We were in the bed inside an hour, and we horsed into each other then for the rest of the afternoon. It was fucking fabulous. A second meeting was arranged. We had dinner in the town. Disaster. Our talk oozed out over the chowder with all the vitality of wet cement. As she gnawed at her steak, I saw that her teeth were a little crooked. There already had been a difficult moment when she ordered it well done, and I asked if she had a fear of blood, and it was possible I had a haughty or even a sniggering tone. Away from Aldo's cottage, the level of my suavity was again in terrible deficit. There was no question of a third time out. The poor girl practically hurdled the waiter as she ran from the place. Maybe it had not been the best idea to get into my suicide attempt over the coffee. I found the ideal thing, as the summer aged, was to keep myself close to the cottage. But even then I wasn't safe from the intruding world. An Italian lady in hiker's gear called by one evening looking for directions and a refill of her water bottle. She nearly pushed the door in on top of me. I hadn't a tap running when she had her boots off by the fireplace and was massaging her toes with her head lolling dangerously. There was no shifting her from the place. After a good hour, I stood up and outright asked her to leave, and she rose up herself, flung me against the antique dresser, and bit my chin. Sadly, I succumbed to it all again on the floor in front of the fireplace. And it went on, or maybe just seemed to, for fucking hours. Shamefully, I had to fake a climax to put a stop to it. Then, before dawn, she took me again. The writing was going tremendously. I was due to deliver my third novel. The central philosophy underpinning all my work to date was that places exerted their own feelings. Nonsense, of course. Half taught out old guff that sounded okay at literary events. But now, here in Aldo's cottage, there was incontrovertible evidence that this was the case. In this place, I was calm, lucid, settled in my skin, and apparently ravishing. Elsewhere, I was, as ever, a bag of spanners. I packed most of Aldo's old clothes for the charity shop in Glentees. I kept a tweed jacket, a few ties, a cap, some excellent brogues. We were a close enough match, size-wise. Long, simian arms, short legs, no arses. I tried to breed and settle. I bought little books that named the trees and the flowers of the vicinity. I drove out to Narran and Port New and swam in the cold sea water. My prose slowed down and took on a more somber note. The third novel was apparently going to be all about family and landscape. But as the summer aged, sleep became troublesome. I began to turn in the bed and the twist of strange groans I'd never heard before. Had more been passed on from my uncle than I'd hoped for? Dark information rushed down the channels of my blood. I found myself waking in deep unease and leaving the cottage in the middle of the night and walking the moonlit roads in the tweed jacket and cap and talking to myself in Aldo's scratchy voice and coarse tone. I was trying to outpace myself in Aldo's stride, but sometimes on these nights I found that I was gaining again. This was the other thing the work was going to be about, that there is no stepping away from the shadow of your past. To face myself, I would have to leave him go. I would have to move on again. I sold my car to a widowed lady from Port New. I had to physically restrain her from me when I was handing over the deeds under the white thorn. I put the cottage on the market. I bought a small van and loaded it. I took the antique bedstead, the flagstones I had managed to pry loose, the fireplace around, the crockery, anything that wasn't nailed down, and I aimed for Francis Street in Dublin and the antique places there. There was no guilt at all. I knew well that I was a maggot, and that in my own unreliable ways I was precisely in the line of Aldo's stock, my reckless, green-eyed uncle who had broken the hearts of nuns and blind girls, had stabbed friends in the shoulders if he missed their backs, had propositioned my mother in the scullery of an Easter Sunday morning, and who once had seen the lights of Moose Jaw burning across the Saskatchewan plain. Thank you very much.